Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Although having options is important, sometimes when we have too many options, things can become complicated, and all the options can turn into a detriment rather than a help. On the other hand, fewer options can actually lead to more creativity, more innovation, and better ideas. Whether we're talking about the workplace or how we function outside of work, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to creativity, having constraints can actually lead to better outcomes and better results. Research shows us that when people are faced with some kind of a constraint, whether it's a constraint of time or resources or any other constraint that you may think of, in many instances that can improve one's focus. Better focus can lead to better ideas, innovations, and end results. Another benefit of constraints, especially when it comes to the number of choices that one may have, is that the fewer choices you have, the less likely you are to be overwhelmed by too many options. And finally, when we look at constraints in terms of framing a project, framing a desired outcome, framing a goal, it is that process of framing, that idea of framing that can help people to stay on track, stay focused, and accomplish goals more quickly, more efficiently, and oftentimes more creatively. It's in those anything goes, nothing's off limits instances that things can become too complicated and it may be too difficult or take too long to actually reach a desired result. What kind of constraints could we examine in terms of better creativity, better innovation, and better end results? Let's start with time. When an individual or a team is on some kind of a time restriction, whether we're talking about an entire project or simply sections or parts of a project, it is by working within such time constraints that people can focus, avoid distractions, and truly produce the best results as compared to times if they didn't have constraints and had allowed distractions into their experience. Therefore, time constraints can be tremendously helpful. And again, time constraints can be seen as short-term time constraints that pertain to specific parts of a project or a task. But of course, time constraints can also refer to the entire length of a project. And a skilled team can successfully use both. Understanding that there is a time constraint or a time limit for the accomplishment of the overall or entire project can be combined with time constraints that pertain to smaller tasks or smaller parts of that project. Material or tech limits can present another form of constraints that can be quite helpful in producing innovative or creative results that may otherwise be fleeting if too many options are available. Having too many tools or technologies can be overwhelming or confusing. Another type of constraint may be one that has to do with a budget. When an individual or a group is faced with a budget limit, they can find themselves needing to be quite creative in order to achieve the desired goal or end result. So budget constraints can also be very helpful. Putting limits or constraints on things such as new features or new things to try can also be helpful. Too many people can be distracted by too many options or too many shiny new objects or shiny new ideas. Whether you're someone who is easily distracted in this manner, or maybe you know someone or work with someone who is easily distracted in this way, you can probably appreciate how sooner or later that can derail a project or delay a goal. So while there's a time and a place for new ideas, for trying new things, doing so because of a constraint is one thing, but doing so for the sake of chasing a shiny new idea or a shiny new object can delay the completion of a project. When a team or an individual is faced with providing a one-page brief on their progress, this type of constraint may be inspirational to keep the project and the process simple, to the point, and as focused as possible. Knowing that you will have to tell others within the company or others on your team what's going on, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and how you're accomplishing it. A summary that's overly complicated can be less than impressive. So limiting yourself or your team to a one-page brief can be just the type of constraint that keeps everyone focused. What's important to remember here before we move forward is that constraints, intentional, deliberate constraints, are very different than lacking resources. Lacking resources can derail a project or push back the attainment of a goal. Lacking resources can affect the quality of results. So it's important for managers and individuals alike to recognize the difference. A constraint that brings in focus is a benefit, but lacking resources can be detrimental. Having said that, it's important to point out that sometimes it is the very lack of resources that brings out the creativity and innovation in people. What that means is that there is a fine line, and it's important to recognize it. There's a difference between lacking resources that can lead people to become more creative and more innovative, and lacking resources that simply prevent people from doing a good job or completing a project or achieving a goal or doing substandard work as a result of it. This is where management comes in. It's absolutely critical for managers to understand the difference and to be able to provide the right kind of balance between constraints, but also resources for their team. And while many individuals, whether it's individuals working alone or individuals that are part of a team, will be able to express which resources are absolutely necessary, ultimately, the manager or whoever is in that leadership position must take the lead, must take that responsibility to ensure that creativity and innovation in an environment that includes some kind of a constraint does not cross the line into the world where resources are lacking when they could be provided otherwise. What would a project look like if we were to introduce some kind of constraints as a means of improving creativity and innovation? First, we have to identify the problem and what the goal is. What is the purpose of the individual's or the team's efforts? This should be quite specific and well defined. Project framing or problem framing should not include a variety of different things, but rather focus on something specific. Once the problem or the project and the goal are understood, then it's important to identify what specific constraint will be introduced into the mix. As an individual or a team of people are working on this project or a problem, what kind of constraint do they have to work within? Is it a time constraint? Is it a budgetary constraint? Is it a tool or options constraint? And keep in mind that there may be more than one constraint. But as I mentioned earlier, it's critical that constraints are not taken to the point of lacking resources that will interfere with the quality of the outcome. Once a problem or a project and a goal are defined and a constraint or perhaps a set of constraints are introduced and understood, it's important to allow the individual or the team to start working on a solution or start working towards the goal. But it's important to remember that if progress is being delayed, or if a solution or the quality of a solution is not what it needs to be, constraints need to be reevaluated. We never want a lack of resources to hurt the outcome, especially if resources could be available, but were simply withheld as part of a practice to introduce constraint. As you play with constraints, it's important to remember that these things should not be written in stone, but rather should be adjusted as needed. Make constraints work for you. Make them work for your benefit rather than having them slow you down, slow down your progress, or delay outcomes. Managers' responsibilities don't end with simply making sure that adequate resources are available and are not inadvertently cut simply by an idea of introducing some type of constraint. Managers must remember to celebrate and recognize people's ability to be creative and innovative. If an individual or a team finds a successful workaround when working within a constraint or a set of constraints, that needs to be recognized and celebrated. This is another way of feeding and encouraging creativity and innovation. Give credit where credit is due. Recognize people and teams for their achievements, but also make sure that the creativity, the innovation that comes out of your experiment with constraints becomes an opportunity for learning. If appropriate, make it available to others within the organization as lessons that they can learn and then implement within their own teams. When implementing the idea of constraints, trial and error is to be expected. It's something that will be refined and improved with time. I cannot stress enough the importance for leaders to remember that constraints and resource starvation are not the same thing. understand the difference and recognize it for what it is so that you're not handicapping your team or your individual employees when they're faced with a task or a project. A good way to give creativity by constraint a try is to pick a project or pick a problem and give it 2 weeks as a trial period for the individual or for the team to work towards a goal or a solution while keeping in mind or working with a constraint or a set of constraints. Evaluate the team's progress or the individual's progress and see how well they did with that specific constraint or set of constraints and go from there. This is an ongoing learning process, and you as a manager will absolutely have to make honest and accurate assessments with the passage of time. And while I address managers, this is just as important for individuals working on tasks or projects. This is something where you can introduce constraints to encourage and test your own creativity and innovation. Just keep in mind that this is supposed to be helpful and not detrimental to you or the organization. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Creativity and innovation can come as an inspiration fueled by certain constraints. Those may be time constraints, resource constraints, tool or technology constraints, or even constraints of the number of ideas that can be introduced into a project or a problem solution. And while science shows us that constraints can give birth to creativity and innovation, it's important that managers and individuals alike understand the difference between constraints and resource starvation. We want constraints to fuel creativity and innovation, not hurt the kind of end results that are produced by the individuals or the team's efforts. It's important that creativity and innovation are recognized and celebrated, and that lessons are learned from that creativity and innovation and passed along as appropriate. A simple 2-week trial for a project or a problem can be introduced as a starting point. Remember that constraints are supposed to be helpful and not detrimental. And as always, be ready to learn and make changes as appropriate. Only then will you be able to master this idea of creativity by constraint. As the week unfolds, I encourage everybody to consider introducing some kind of constraint into their working experience, whether you work on an individual basis or as part of a team. What kind of constraint could you introduce to the project or to a part of a project as a means of boosting creativity and innovation? If your organization is not one that is currently using constraints as a way of boosting creativity and innovation, I encourage you to start a conversation as a means of potentially bringing this idea to your workplace experience. It's no secret that having too many choices or no constraints whatsoever can derail a project. So why not start introducing constraints, even on a small scale, as a way of gaining focus and better end results? For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. Once you're there, check out some of the other videos. They focus on stress management. Stress Free with Dr. G is available on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me here today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.